Edward Cullen is still the furthest possible thing from a consent king. He does indeed violate consent and autonomy constantly throughout all 4 books, and it does appear we need a bit of a refresher, but first, let me explain why I'm doing this. First of all, because I do get asked often, of course, but it is never to police fandom or tell anybody that they can't like Edward. He's not real. I understand that this is a fictional supernatural romance, and I promise I don't care if you like him. But when the general fandom uses consent to praise Edward, as they very much do every day, it not only glorifies the misogyny and behavior you claim to be speaking against, but actively perpetuates the racism written into the series. Because it's most often used as a way to police fandom A and project that 100-year-old Edward was somehow morally superior to Jacob, who was 16 at the time, when he absolutely was not. He had no excuse, he was not victimized by a racist narrative, and after living 100 years, he should have known better from his first appearance. Starting with the big ones, of course, Edward was actively stalking Bella for weeks and weeks before they had any sort of relationship without Bella's knowledge. He followed her to various locations, watched her through her windows from the trees outside her house, and of course, was breaking into her bedroom every night to watch her sleep. And before anyone says it, even if Edward had some perceived well-intended reason for doing this, it wouldn't matter because it's still a blatant violation, but he didn't even have a good reason. His original motivations for breaking into Bella's bedroom were not even about her protection, but for his own self-righteous reasons to get used to her scent, because he insisted on staying in Forks and forcing proximity with Bella, even though he was pretty sure he might unalive her to impress Carlisle and to prove he's not a monster. And when he does start to justify his actions under the guise of protection, he uses grandiose projections of dangers that don't actually exist, like a meteor might hit the house and he's got to be there to catch the spiders. He also justifies stalking Bella from the trees outside her house by saying that if Mike, just some dude, basic teenager Newton, were there, he would be doing it for the wrong reasons. But his reasons are righteous. Of course, at this point, he is still pretty sure he might unalive her. When he returns after abandoning Bella, he forbids her from seeing Jacob and her friends at La Push, isolating her from her friends, and goes as far as to disable her car so she can't go there, damaging her property and actively inhibiting her independence and autonomy, and enlists Alice to kidnap her by bribing her with a Porsche. If you want to talk bodily autonomy, Edward was going to, not just willing, but was going to strap Bella down and forcibly terminate Little Resentment against her will, and would have with Carlisle's help had Rosalie not been her bodyguard. He once again takes it several steps further by propositioning Jacob without Bella's knowledge and telling him that if he can convince Bella to 86 RuneScape, he can impregnate her with his puppies. These are all significant violations of consent and autonomy, and in general, Edward constantly disregards Bella's wants and wishes, makes decisions for her, and lies to her to do so. But people love to counter this with, well, Edward never got physical with Bella, which, first of all, again, is not a good argument, but is also completely incorrect. In New Moon, during the vote, Edward throws a huge tantrum because he doesn't want Bella to turn, screams at her, breaks a TV, and grabs her jaw so tightly that her words come out distorted. There are instances where Edward physically restrains her. There are instances where Bella says no and Edward keeps going. Like at the end of New Moon, where Bella wants to go to Jacob and Edward physically restrains her and says no. Like the blood type scene where Edward drags Bella and forcibly picks her up and puts her in his car despite her contrary protests. When they return home in New Moon, Bella says no to a kiss from Edward, and Edward continues before ever receiving consent for that kiss. Just because we know she was operating under a false assumption doesn't mean he received consent for that. And this list is not all-encompassing, and it's not even getting into Edward's other offenses like his manipulation, classism, racism, general cruelty, and disregard for people. But if you specifically want to have a discussion about consent, Edward and his family violate consent all the time, like Carlisle. I've discussed this at length. But the way he turns people, medical malpractice, drugging people on the side of the road, stealing Jacob's blood without his knowledge. And if you choose to take this opportunity to list all the reasons you hate Jacob, or to write excuses for Edward, because I know that's exactly what so many of you are itching to do, you have missed the point. Because while the concept of consent is clearly steamrolled and disregarded constantly throughout the books, Stephanie acknowledged it one time, and regardless of what her intent was or what she meant to write, it was in the form of a very textbook racist trope, where Jacob kisses Bella without her consent, and Edward gets to swoop in and save her, be the hero, and threaten him with racist rhetoric, and is praised for it despite the fact that he has been violating consent and autonomy and manipulating since book 1 and continues to do so through book 4 because he was saving her from the aggressive brown man in a story where she assigned the werewolves, and therefore exclusively the native characters, with uncontrollable anger and aggression and inability to control themselves. And what that ultimately serves to do, regardless of her intent or yours, as we see with the way these characters are received, is inflate this narrative that glorifies Edward and rewrites history to present him as a consent king, effectively echoing the white man good, brown man bad narrative that was written into the story. Nobody is ever saying that Jacob never did anything wrong or that his worst actions were okay. But he is not at all equatable to 100-year-old Edward, and the fact that he receives by far the most condemnation is no coincidence. And if this is pointed out to you and your response is still to police fandom about Jacob, or write excuses about why Edward or any of the Cullens are better or justified, you're demonstrating once again that you don't actually care about the issues you claim to care about. You care about bashing Jacob, and you should examine why. And if you're not willing to do that, I will say it a million times, this is not the place for you.